And he actually does this by telling us how to find these features. So he's advocating the tracing of contrary qualities in prose and poetry, that is, looking for poetry in prose and prose in poetry. So he says, to find in the poem, amid the flowers, the allusions, the mixed perspectives of Lycidas, for instance, the thought, the logical structure, and these are qualities of prose. How wholesome. So, how rewarding will it be to find elements, features of prose in poetry? How delightful as to identify in prose what we call the poetry, the imaginative power. So, similarly, when you look up a prose piece, how delightful will it be to identify features that normally would be seen in a prose piece? And then he substantiates this argument by giving Dryden's example, whose position as a critic he challenges by citing his own work. So he says, and I quote from here, Dryden, now John Dryden, he says, with the characteristic instinct of his age, loved to emphasize the distinction between poetry and prose. So John Dryden was such a critic who loved to talk about the separate genres of poetry and prose and to speak separately, distinctly about the features that defined prose and the features that defined poetry. And he didn't want uh, writers to confuse the genres with each other. So he felt that writers who wrote poetry should stick to the features that made great poetry, and writers who wrote prose should only stick to the parameters or the kind of features which went into the making of good poetry. And yet, he says that this is strange coming from a person like Dryden, whose own uh, whose own contribution, whose own poems. If Dryden is known for his satirical works, right? So Dryden's own poems are so prosaic. There are so many elements of prose in Dryden's poems, and coming from Dryden, the critic, who says do not mix the genres, it is ironic because Dryden himself keeps mixing the genres all the time. And in truth, his sense of prosaic excellence affected his verse rather than his prose. So he says Dryden was such an excellent writer of prose that he brought the features of prose in poetry, in the poems he wrote, and his poems as a result became differently flavored. He created a completely different genre, and that was such a delightful genre, right? And then he moves on to talk about the poet, the romantic poet Wordsworth, and he says, and how the poetic scope was expanded by Wordsworth. So he says the range of the poetic force in literature was effectively enlarged by Wordsworth. So obviously he's championing the idea that poetry could have features of prose and prose could have features of poetry, and this he substantiates by citing the example of first John Dryden and then William Wordsworth, who he says was in fact came up with a new poetic force in literature. Wordsworth, we know, broke radical ground. He said poetry should be written in everyday language, and poetry should be about topics that are familiar to the common villager, right? And that is how so if you want poetry to be written about themes and topics that are common to villagers or that villagers are familiar with, then you also have to use it or write it in a language that appeals to villagers or that appeals to rustics and rustics are familiar with. And this is the breakthrough, the literary breakthrough which Wordsworth achieved, right? So Walter Pater, by citing Dryden and Wordsworth, is trying to say that let's not be too rigid or too fixated about poetry having a distinct style and prose having a distinct style. And these are some important points. He says the line between fact and something quite different from external fact is indeed hard to draw, because facts add become pleadings at times, and therefore subjective. So he says, so he moves on to fact. Now this is a separate argument that he's making. From talking about how poetry and prose can be embellished with features of each other, he moves on to talk about two disciplines: A, science, and B, history, which are both very fact based uh, knowledge streams when compared to literature, which is presumed to be more imaginative and creative and based on fiction, right? But he says, can we really say that history or science is a factual text? So he says the line between fact, so the division or the line that divides fact from external facts is hard to draw, because sometimes when the writer is stating a fact, so for example, there's a historian who is writing a historical fact, but the historian will bring his perspective to the fact, and so that his reader, so that the historian's reader believes the historian, or in order to convince or persuade the reader, the historian can also often resort to pleadings at times, and that is where the subjective element comes in. So the historian becomes subjective or personally invested in that particular text. So can we actually say that historical texts or scientific texts are very objective or very factual, or they are very neutral? No, we can't, because eventually they are being written by people, and people will come with their biases, their interests, and their agendas, which is bound to reflect in the texts that they are writing. And so, and this he speaks with regard to history and science, which are presumed to be factual, unlike literature, and then points at the loophole. So, and here I quote Walter Pater. He says, your historian, for instance, with absolutely truthful intention. So, no one over here is doubting or casting aspersions on the historian's intention. The historian may be completely honest, but the historian has a multitude of facts presented to him, and he must select from these facts. He can't pass on everything, right? So he will select. There is an exercise of selective writing and representation. So he will select, and in the process of selecting, assert something of his own humor, something that the historian personally likes. So he is going to express something which appeals to him at a personal level, and something that comes not of the world without, but of a vision within. So that's something which he selects, and that's something which he talks about, or which he promotes, or which he favorably depicts, is not a product of the external world, but of his inner vision. And in that sense, it is a subjective text. So we cannot say history is not a subjective text, right? And so, thus, more than a fact, it becomes the historian's sense of fact. So he says it is not then fact anymore, because the historian hasn't presented it neutrally or objectively. It becomes the historian's sense of fact. And moving on, so he says the transcript of his sense, and so he has established that history is not factual, but it is a kind of it incorporates within it the vision of the historian. And now he goes on to talk about literature. So he says, in literature, as in every other product of human skill, in the molding of a bell or a platter, for instance, wherever the sense asserts itself, so even if you're making a bell or a plate, so that's also a skill, right? But even those things carry the maker's sense. Wherever the producer so modifies his work as over and above its primary use or intention to make it pleasing to himself, of course, in the first instance, there, fine as opposed to merely serviceable art exists. So, One kind of art is serviceable art, where you have dinner plates. So all dinner plates are the same, right? You have the same dinner plates, your neighbors have the same dinner plates, you have all bought them at the same supermarket. So that is serviceable art, serviceable product, a product which exists to serve you or to provide some kind of service. But if above its utility, more than its use, there is something in that piece, something in that plate, or something in that bowl, which the producer of that bowl has put over there to please themselves or to please you. That becomes fine art. Okay, so there could be a painting, there could be some carving, and that carving you will not find in another plate. Then that plate becomes a piece of fine art. That is what he's saying. So what makes it unique is the writer's intention, or the maker's intention, to please himself or the other person, in Walter Pater's words. So literary art, that is like all other art, which is in any way imitative or reproductive of fact. So all art is imitative. This is what Plato and Aristotle propounded, right? And literary art is like all the other arts, and it is imitative, and it reproduces from fact. Form or color or incident is the representation of such fact as connected with soul of a specific personality. So any work of art which reflects the soul of its creator becomes fine art, becomes a work of fine art. So, in this manner, Walter Pater shows how those fields that dwell with prose and are supposed to be factual have commonalities with literature, which is supposed to be fictional, and also how fine art becomes unique when it has the creator's signature. Signature in the form of something unique only to that particular piece, right? So you won't find it in any other piece. So if it's a flower vase, for instance, so flower vase is meant to have flowers. But if there is a particular carving or an etching which is unique to that particular flower vase, which the which the artist has carved or etched by hand or painted, then it becomes fine art. Hmm? And over here, Walter Pater looks at verse in the literary art form as only one of the features of literature, and in fact foregrounds the importance of imaginative prose, calling it the special art of the modern world. So he says what we need is imaginative prose. So poetic elements in prose that is going to make it richer and more beautiful and appealing. And saying this, he attributes the following qualities to prose. He calls it an instrument of many stops: meditative, observant, descriptive, eloquent, analytic, plaintive, fervid. So these are the numerous attributes he reserves for prose, and he says prose should have all these qualities. It should have many pauses, it should allow us to reflect, to observe, it should be descriptive, it should allow us to meditate. Meditate is contemplate, think about it. It should be eloquent also, free flowing. It should help us analyze also, right? So all of that should be the features of prose.